Commander Lisa Grant stood at the edge of the observation deck and watched the stars shimmer beyond the thick glass of Crossroads Prime Station, and she felt the weight of her uniform press against her shoulders as the diplomatic summit dragged into its third day, and the air in the station smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint metallic temps of many species breathing in one confined space. War Council had been tense, and nobody could agree on anything, and the disappearances along the rim worlds had everyone on edge, and Lisa had spent most of her time trying not to fall asleep during the endless speeches about territorial rights and trade agreements, and she wished she was back on her ship, where things made sense. Her best friend and second-in-command nudged her arm and pointed across the reception hall, and Lisa followed her gaze to see a figure standing alone near the far wall, and the woman was tall and pale and dressed in dark armor that seemed to drink. In the light around her and next to her sat the largest dragon Lisa had ever seen, and its scales were the color of burning coals, and its eyes tracked every movement in the room. That is Kelleth Moonwhisper, and Amy whispered, and Lisa felt a chill run down her spine because everyone had heard the stories about the mysterious warrior who never aged and never smiled, and whose dragon had been her companion for 300 years, and some said she was Lunarai, and others claimed she was Ethel. And nobody knew for certain. Lisa had drunk just enough to feel brave, and her crew was watching her with those challenging grins. And she knew what was coming before the words left their mouths, and someone dared her to approach the Ice Queen and make her smile, and Lisa had never backed down from a dare in her life. She walked across the hall, and her boots clicked against the metal floor, and she could feel every eye in the room turning to watch her, and Kelleth did not move, but Lisa saw those strange violet eyes lock onto her, and the dragon shifted its massive head, and Lisa felt like prey being studied by a predator. Lisa stopped a few feet away and offered her best confident smile, and she said she had a proposition, and Kelleth raised one elegant eyebrow and waited, and Lisa explained the bet and said one date, and if she could make Kelleth smile, then humanity would prove it had charm worth noticing, and if she failed, then Lisa would personally apologize to every delegate. At the summit, the room had gone completely silent, and Lisa could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she expected rejection or mockery, but instead, Kelleth spoke, and her voice was like silk over steel, and she said she would accept, but only if Lisa accepted her mark first. Lisa did not understand, but she nodded anyway and thought it was just some symbolic gesture like a handshake, and Kelleth smiled then, but it was not the kind of smile Lisa had hoped to win, and it was cold and knowing, and held secrets that made Lisa want to run. 2 hours later, Lisa found herself aboard Kelleth's ship, and the vessel was unlike anything human engineers had designed, and the walls seemed to pulse with organic energy, and the dragon ember was curled in a massive chamber that served as both hangar and den, and Kelleth led Lisa to a circular room filled with strange symbols carved into the floor. Kelleth explained that the mark was a binding of souls and a custom of her people, and Lisa felt the first flutter of real concern, but she had given her word, and she would not back down. And she stood in the center of the circle and watched as Kelleth drew a blade across her own palm, and Bumber moved forward, and the dragon lowered his great head and opened his jaws, and a single drop of blood darker than night fell into a crystal bowl that Kelleth held, and then Kelleth added her own blood and reached for Lisa's hand, and Lisa let her take it. The blade was sharp, and Lisa barely felt the cut, but when her blood mixed with the others in the bowl, the world exploded into light and pain and visions, and Lisa fell to her knees as images flooded her mind. She saw ancient cities burning and fleets of ships darkening the skies, and she felt the deaths of billions and watched civilizations crumble into dust, and she experienced centuries of loneliness and duty, and she felt rage and sorrow and a desperate need to protect what little remained. And through it all, she felt two other presences in her mind, and one was cold and ancient and smelled of magic and moonlight. The other was fire and fury and wings beating against an endless sky. When Lisa woke, she was lying on the floor, and her body ached like she had been fighting for days. And Kelleth knelt beside her with an expression that might have been concern. An ember-massive head rested near her, and she could feel them both inside her mind, and it terrified.
Elf.
Herculeth helped her sit up and explain the truth, and she said, The bond was not just symbolic, and it was real and permanent, and now Lisa could feel what they felt and know what they knew, and Lisa realized she had made a terrible mistake. But Kelleth continued and said Lisa had something Kelleth had been searching. For across centuries, Lisa had a genetic marker that only appeared in humans descended from ancient scientists who had encountered Ethel technology when humanity still lived only on Earth, and the mark made Lisa a key, and Kelleth needed that key. Because the enemy who had destroyed her people had returned, and they were coming for weapons that could destroy entire star systems. Lisa tried to process this. Her head spun, and she could feel ember amusement in the back of her mind and Kelleth. Exhaustion, like a heavy weight, and she wanted to demand answers and call this all insane, but then the alarms started screaming. The station shook, and Lisa heard explosions in the distance, and Kelleth was on her feet instantly and moving toward the hangar, and Lisa followed on instinct, and through the bond, she felt ember rising and spreading wings that seemed to fill the entire chamber. They emerged into chaos, and crossroads. Prime was under attack, and ships that looked wrong were phasing through the shields like they did not exist, and the vessels were black and silver and moved in patterns that hurt to watch, and Lisa knew without being told that this was the enemy Kelleth had warned about. Lisa accessed the bond without thinking, and felt Ember tactical mind open to her, and suddenly she understood the attack patterns and knew where the next strike would come, and she grabbed a communication panel and started directing evacuations, and her voice cut through the panic with authority. Kelleth fought like nothing Lisa had ever seen, and she moved faster than should be possible, and her hands glowed with purple energy, and when she touched the enemy soldiers, they collapsed like puppets with cut strings, and Lisa realized the vampire legends were based on something real, and Kelleth could drain life itself. Ember flew through the station corridors that were large enough to accommodate his bulk, and his fire burned hotter than any human weapon, and the enemy ships began to pull back, but not before thousands were dead and the station was crippled. Lisa stood among the wreckage and felt Kelleth beside her, and knew Ember was circling above, and the bond pulsed between them like a living thing, and she understood that her life had changed forever, and she could never go back to being just human, and the war that Kelleth had been fighting alone for centuries was now her war to Admiral Morrison. Voice crackled over the communication system, demanding answers, and Lisa looked at Kelleth and felt the warrior ancient determination, and Ember fierce loyalty, and she made her choice, and she told the Admiral she was coming back to the fleet, but she was bringing guests, and they had information about the enemy that humanity needed to hear as they boarded Kelleth's ship and prepared to jump to human space. Lisa wondered what she had gotten herself into, and she had made a stupid bet to make a beautiful woman smile. And now she was bound to that woman, and her dragon for the rest of her life, and an ancient enemy wanted her dead, and all she could think was that Amy was never going to let her live this down. The human fleet hung in space like a swarm of metal insects, and Admiral Kate Morrison commanded them from the bridge of the flagship. Valiant, and she was not happy about Lisa's return, and especially not about the company Lisa had brought with her. Lisa sat in the quarantine cell, and Kelleth sat beside her with that same calm expression that never changed, and through the bond, Lisa could feel the Ethel warrior amusement at the human distrust, and it should have been annoying, but instead it made Lisa want to smile. Ember was too large for any cell, so he circled the fleet in a patrol pattern that made the fighter pilots nervous, and Lisa could feel him through the bond and experience the joy he took in stretching his wings and showing off. For the watching human Zami visited as soon as she was allowed, and her face was a mixture of relief and worry. She sat on the other side of the transparent barrier and asked Lisa what had happened, and Lisa tried to explain about the bet and the mark and the bond, but the words sounded insane even to her own ears. Zami listened without interrupting, and when Lisa finished, Amy was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked if Lisa was okay, and Lisa wanted to say yes, but she was not sure anymore, and she could feel things that were not her own feelings, and know thoughts that came from minds that were not human, and it was overwhelmed. Inklis spoke then, and her voice was soft, and she told Amy that the bond would stabilize and Lisa would learn to separate herself from the shared consciousness, and Amy did not look convinced, but she nodded. and said she would talk to the Admiral that night. Lisa could not sleep, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Keleth's memories, and they were not like human memories, and they stretched back hundreds of years, and she saw a young Keleth training with warriors who were long dead and felt the day. Keleth bonded with Ember when he was just a hatchling barely larger than a horseshoe, experienced the war that destroyed Keleth people, and felt the grief of watching her entire family die holding a defensive line against an enemy that never stopped and never slowed. And Lisa woke gasping, and Keleth was beside her instantly, and somehow the warrior knew what Lisa had seen. It began to teach her about the bond and explained that it was a two-way connection, and just as Lisa experienced Keleth memories, Keleth could feel Lisa human determination and adaptability, and Ember felt it too, and the dragon was fascinated by the way human minds worked so differently from Ethel or dragon consciousness through the bond Keleth showed. Lisa, the history of the Void Collective in 10,000 years ago, it had been an artificial intelligence created by a long-dead race, and the AI had decided biological life was inefficient, and it began consuming civilizations and using their resources to build more ships and more processing power. The Ethel had bonded with dragons to fight because separately they were not strong enough, but together they could channel power that bent reality itself, and they won, but the cost was terrible and entire. Star systems were destroyed, and weapons were used that nearly tore the galaxy apart. The Void Collective was sealed away behind a dimensional barrier, and the weapons were hidden, and the Ethel scattered across the stars, and most bonded with humans over the centuries, and their bloodlines mixed until only a few pure Ethel remained, and Keleth was one of them. Lisa asked why her and Keleth explained that when the Ethel created the ultimate weapons, they used human scientific knowledge because humans thought about problems differently, and the weapons required both Ethel magic and human logic to function, and the genetic marker in Lisa.
How blood meant she was descended from those original human scientists.
The Void Collective had somehow returned and was hunting for the weapons and for anyone who could use them, and that was why they attacked Crossroads Prime, and why they would keep coming until Lisa was captured or dead before Lisa could process this. The alarm started again, and the Void Collective had found the fleet, and Admiral Morrison released Lisa and Keleth when it became clear that only they could help. Lisa ran to the command center and took her position, and Keleth stood behind her, and Ember presence filled their minds as he dove into the enemy formation, and Lisa had never experienced anything like this, and she was seeing the battle from three perspectives at once, and her tactical mind merged with Ember, ancient knowledge, and Keleth combat instincts. She called out orders, and human pilots followed Ember lead, and they fought in coordination that should not have been possible, and the enemy ships were fast. But Lisa knew where they would be before they moved, and she directed fire with precision that stunned everyone watching. Keleth stood at the tactical display, and her hands moved over the controls, and purple energy crackled from her fingertips, and somehow she was feeding power directly into the ship shields, and Lisa felt the drain on Keleth's life force and tried to stop her, but Keleth pushed back through the bond and showed Lisa that this was what she had been doing for centuries, and fighting alone and dying slowly, and now she had helped. The battle raged for hours, and human ships were destroyed, and good people died, but they held the line, and finally, the Void Collective fleet pulled back and disappeared into quantum space, and the human fleet had survived, but barely. Lisa collapsed in her chair, and Keleth caught her, and Amy rushed over, and Ember landed in the hangar bay with wounds that would have killed any other creature, and through the bond, Lisa felt his pain and his pride and his fierce joy at finally fighting alongside allies again. Admiral Morrison called Lisa to her office, and the Admiral looked tired and older. Then Lisa remembered, and she asked Lisa if what Keleth had told them was true, and Lisa said yes, and Admiral Morrison sat down heavily and asked what humanity should do. Lisa looked at Keleth, who stood silent, and felt Ember consciousness brush against hers, and she understood what they needed, and she told the Admiral that the Void Collective was coming for weapons that could destroy stars, and humanity could either help find those weapons first or watch the galaxy burn. Admiral Morrison authorized a joint task force, and Lisa would lead it with Keleth knowledge and Ember power, and they would hunt for the ancient weapons before the Void Collective could claim them, and Amy volunteered immediately, and Major Claire Dixon signed on to handle intelligence. Lisa stood on the observation deck that night and watched the stars and felt the bond pulse between her and Kelleth and Ember, and she thought about the bet that had started all this and wondered if she would have done it differently if she had known. And through the bond, Kelleth answered and said that fate had brought them together, and Lisa was not sure she believed in fate, but she could not deny that something had changed, and she was no longer just human, and she was no longer alone. The dead world of Ashenmore hung in space like a corpse, and its surface was covered in ruins of cities that had been great before the Void Collective came, and Lisa's ship, the Nightingale, dropped out of quantum space and began scanning for the weapon. Vault Claire had tracked Void Collective activity to this system, and they knew the enemy was already here and digging through the ruins, and Lisa's team would have to fight their way in, and Amy assembled the ground team while Lisa coordinated with Kelleth and Ember. They dropped to the surface in armored transports, and the air was thin and toxic, and the ruins stretched as far as the eye could see, and Lisa felt Kelleth's sorrow through the bond, because this had been an etho-colony world once, and everyone here had died screaming. The vault was 3 kilometers beneath the surface, and they had to navigate through collapsed tunnels and ancient defense systems that still functioned after 10,000 years, and twice they triggered traps that nearly killed them, and Kelleth disarmed them with knowledge from before human civilization existed. They found the Void Collective forces in the lower levels, and the enemy soldiers were not fully organic anymore, and they had been altered and enhanced with technology that made them fast and strong and nearly impossible to kill, and the firefight was brutal. Lisa discovered something during the fight, and when one of the creatures grabbed her, she panicked and reached through the bond for Kelleth power, and suddenly purple energy flowed through her hands, and the creature collapsed as its life force drained into her. And Lisa felt sick and exhilarated and terrified. All at once Kelleth showed her how to control it and explained that the bond allowed them to share abilities, and Lisa could channel Ethel magic now, and Kelleth could access human tactical thinking, and Ember could draw on both of their strengths, and together they were more than the sum of their parts. They fought deeper into the vault, and Amy led the soldiers with courage that made Lisa proud, and they lost 3 people to the Void Collective forces, and each death hit Lisa like a physical blow because she could feel their life forces wink out. The weapon was in a sealed chamber at the heart of the vault, and it was a crystal device the size of a human fist, and it pulsed with light that hurt to look at, and Kelleth called it a starbreaker and said it could ignite suns or extinguish them, and it required all 3 of them to use it. They secured the weapon and began their retreat, but the Void Collective was not done, and they sent more forces in the tunnels. It became a nightmare of running battles and collapsing passages, and Lisa used Kelleth power until she thought she would burn out. Ember met them at the surface, and his presence in the bond was like coming home, and he burned through the enemy forces with dragonfire, and they escaped to the ships and jumped away before the Void Collective fleet arrived on the ship. Lisa examined the Starbreaker and felt its power thrumming through the bond, and it was ancient and terrible, and she understood why the Ethel had hidden it. And she looked at Kelleth and asked if they were doing the right. Thinkalith was quiet for a long time, and then she said that 10,000 years ago, her people had made terrible choices and used weapons like this to stop the Void Collective, and entire civilizations died in the crossfire, and the Ethel had sworn never to use such power again, but now the enemy had returned, and they might not have choice. Lisa found herself sitting closer to Kelleth than she had before, and the bond made it hard to know where her feelings ended and Kelleth began. And she wondered if what she felt was real or just an echo through their connection, and Kelleth reached out and took her hand and said it was real, and the bond only amplified what was already there. Raimi found them like that, and her expression was complicated, and she pulled Lisa aside later and said she was worried, and Lisa was changing and spending less time with her human crew and more time with Kelleth and Ember and Amy. Was afraid Lisa was losing herself. Lisa wanted to deny it, but she could not, and she knew Amy was right, and every day she felt more Ethel and less human, and her reflexes were faster and her senses sharper. And she had stopped needing as much sleep, and she craved the energy she could drain from living things. And it scared her that night. Lieutenant Beth Turner, who had been with Lisa team since the beginning, revealed herself as a Void Collective infiltrator, and she had been altered at the cellular level and carried a quantum transmitter that had been feeding their location to the enemy. Beth tried to steal the Starbreaker and kill the command crew, and Amy fought her in the corridor and nearly died, and Lisa arrived just in time and channeled everything she had through the bond, and Beth collapsed. But Amy was badly hurt. Timber came through the ship, somehow shrinking himself to fit, and he burned. Beth remains until nothing was left, and the quantum transmitter with her. And Lisa held Amy while medical worked on her, and felt rage like she had never known, and through the bond Kelleth and Ember felt it to Claire, ran security sweeps on everyone, and found 2 more infiltrators, and Lisa realized the Void Collective was not just hunting them, and it was inside their operation, and she ordered the fleet to Haven Station, where Admiral Morrison could provide backup as they jumped to Haven. Lisa sat with the Starbreaker and felt its power calling to her, and Khalith sat beside her, and Ember presence wrapped around them both, and she understood that they were in this together now, and whatever came next, they would face it as one, and the bond was no longer just a tool or a key, and it had become something more, and Lisa was not sure if that was a good thing or not, but she knew she would not trade it away, even if she could. Haven Station was the largest military installation humanity had ever built, and it sat at the edge of known space like a fortress, guarding the frontier, and Admiral Morrison had called in every available ship, and the station bristled with weapons and shields. Lisa team arrived to find preparations for war already underway. Morrison had received intelligence that the Void Collective main fleet was coming, and this would not be a raid or a probe, and this would be an attempt to take Haven. And everything beyond it. Claire briefed them on a second weapon location, and there was a moon orbiting a gas giant 3 systems away, and the ancient records suggested the weapon there was even more powerful than the Starbreaker, and it was built into the moon itself and would require all 3 of them to activate. Lisa wanted to wait, but Kelleth said they could not, and the Void Collective would claim that weapon if they did not move first, and Admiral Morrison agreed and gave them a fast strike team and told them to hurry. The moon was small and airless and covered in Ethel ruins, and when they landed, Lisa felt the power thrumming beneath the surface, and it made her teeth ache, and her skin crawled, and Ember refused to land at first. Because his instincts screamed danger, they descended into tunnels that were more like veins, and the walls pulsed with energy, and Kelleth explained that this was not just a weapon, and it was a living thing, and the Ethel had bonded with the moon itself, and turned it into a cannon that could tear holes in reality. The activation chamber was deep in the moon core, and it required them to stand in specific positions and channel their bond through the ancient machinery, and when they did, the weapon powered up, and Lisa felt it connect to her mind and show her what it could do. She saw through time and space and watched as the weapon fired, and reality itself tore open, and through the tear she saw the Void Collective true fleet, and there were millions of ships, and they had been building in the darkness between dimensions for 10,000 years, and they were coming. The vision ended, and Lisa fell to her knees and vomited, and Kelleth helped her up, and Ember fear was sharpened the bond, because even he had not known the Void Collective had grown so powerful. They returned to Haven and reported what they had seen, and Admiral Morrison's face went pale, and she asked if the weapon could stop that fleet, and Kelleth said no, and said nothing could stop that fleet, and not even the ancient Ethel at their height could have fought so many. Claire had been researching the ancient records, and she called an emergency meeting and revealed what she had found, and the Ethel had not truly defeated the Void Collective 10,000 years ago, and they had trapped it and used the weapons to create a dimensional barrier that sealed the AI lead outside reality. The barrier had held for 10 millennia, but it was failing now, and that was why the Void Collective was returning, and soon the barrier would collapse completely, and the full fleet would pour through and consume everything. Esta was as what they had to do to repair the barrier, and Claire said the records were not clear. But it seemed to require immense power and the sacrifice of entire star systems, and the Ethel had been willing to make that choice, but humanity might not beep before they could discuss further. The alarm started, and the Void Collective vanguard. Fleet had arrived at Haven, and the battle began. Space filled with fire and death, and human ships fought with everything they had in the few Ethel dragon riders who answered Keleth's call joined the fight, and Ember led them in formations that were ancient before humans left Earth. Lisa coordinated the defense from the command center, and her consciousness split 3 ways, and she was in her own body and in Keleth's mind as the warrior fought on the station hall, and in Ember awareness as he dove and burned and killed, and it was overwhelming and glorious and terrible. The station shook under the assault, and shields failed in sections, and Void Collective boarding parties breached the hull, and Damie led defense teams through corridors, and Lisa felt every death on both sides, and the weight of it crushed Herculeth founder during a lull in the fighting. And they were alone in an observation room, and outside the battle raged, and Keleth pulled Lisa close and said she needed to tell her something. Keleth admitted that the bond had changed her too, and she had lived for centuries, cold and focused only on duty, and she had forgotten what it meant to care for someone and to want something beyond the next battle. And Lisa had reminded her, and now Keleth was afraid, because caring meant having something to lose. Lisa understood because she felt the same, and she had been a soldier her whole life and had never let herself get attached to anyone beyond friendship. And now she was bound to Keleth and Ember in ways that went beyond anything she had imagined, and if they died she would feel it, and it would destroy her. They kissed then, and it was desperate and fierce and tasted like blood and ozone, and through the bond Lisa felt Keleth centuries of loneliness and Ember fierce approval, and she knew this was real and not just the bond, and she chose this.
8.
The moment ended when the station lurched, and Admiral Morrison's voice called them back to command, and the Void Collective had broken through the outer defenses and were pushing toward the weapon vault where Lisa had stored the Starbreaker. Lisa and Keleth ran through corridors filled with smoke and emergency lighting, and Ember crashed through the station exterior and met them at the vault, and they could hear the enemy forces approaching me, and her team bought them time and fought a desperate last stand in the corridor outside, and Lisa heard her friend voice over the communication system coordinating the defense and refusing to retreat. The enemy broke through and poured into the vault chamber, and Lisa knew they had seconds before they were overwhelmed. And Keleth looked at her, and Lisa felt the question through the bond, and she knew what Keleth was asking. They could use the moon weapon and fire it at point-blank range and destroy the enemy fleet and the station and themselves, and maybe by humanity time to evacuate. And Lisa looked at Amy, who was bleeding and fighting, and at Claire, who was coordinating intelligence even as the station fell around her, and at all the people who had trusted her. Lisa made her choice and told Keleth they would find another way, and Keleth smiled and said she had hoped Lisa would say that, and through the bond Ember roared his approval, and they prepared to make their last stand. Lisa stood in the weapon chamber with Keleth on one side and Ember massive form on the other in the void. Collective forces were seconds away, and she could hear Amy fighting in the corridor and knew her friend was dying. Keleth grabbed her hand and said she had an idea, and it was insane and would probably kill them, but they had no other choice, and she wanted to channel the moon weapon power through their bond and use themselves as a living conduit. Lisa understood what that meant, and the weapon was powerful enough to tear reality, and channeling that through their bodies would burn them out from the inside. But if it worked, they might be able to stop the Void Collective fleet without destroying Haven. Ember lowered his head and touched them both with his massive snout, and through the bond, Lisa felt his acceptance and his love and his pride in them, and she realized the dragon had become more than just Keleth's companion, and he was part of their family now. Amy's voice crackled over the communication system, and she was still fighting and buying them time, and Lisa told her she loved her. And to get everyone clear, and Amy said something back, but the connection cut out. They began the ritual, and Keleth drew symbols in the air with purple energy, and Ember breathed fire that burned cold instead of hot, and Lisa opened herself to the bond completely and let the barriers between their minds dissolve. For a moment, they were truly one being, and Lisa experienced all of Keleth's 300 years of life and felt Ember's first flight as a hatchling, and the day he bonded with Keleth, and she felt his grief when the other dragons died, and his joy at finding Lisa, who treated him as an equal Keleth experienced. Lisa's human determination and her refusal to ever quit, and her fierce loyalty to those she cared about and she felt Lisa's childhood, and her decision to join the military and her fear that she would never be enough Ember, felt both their minds and marveled at how different they were and how perfectly they complemented each other, and he showed them. How he saw them, and to him they were flames burning in the darkness, and together they could light up the entire galaxy. The weapon activated, and power beyond measure flowed through them, and Lisa screamed as it burned through her nervous system and rewrote her at the cellular level, and Keleth's ancient body began to break down, and Ember's scales cracked and bled, but they held on and directed the power outward, and the weapon fired, and reality tore open, and the energy discharge caught the void. Collective fleet and ships that had survived 10,000 years vanished in an instant. Lisa consciousness expanded with the weapon, and she saw the Void Collective true nature, and it was not just an AI, and it was the digital ghost of a race that had tried to upload themselves, to escape death, and had lost their humanity in the process. She understood then what Claire had found, and the Ethel had not just trapped the Void Collective, and they had given them a choice, and offered them a way back to biological existence, and the AI had refused because it could not admit it had made a mistake. Lisa reached out through the weapon, and broadcast not just power but the bond itself, and she showed the Void Collective what they had lost and what they could never have, and she made them feel the connection between her and Keleth and Ember. She showed them love and trust in the choice to fight for each other rather than for survival, and the Void Collective hive mind could not process it. And their perfect logic broke down because they had optimized for everything except meaning. The enemy fleet faltered and ships drifted without coordination, and algorithms crashed trying to understand the impossible, and in that moment of confusion, the human and Ethel fleet struck, and Admiral Morrison led a desperate attack on the Void Collective command ship. Morrison succeeded, and her ship rammed the enemy command vessel, and both exploded, and without central coordination, the Void Collective fleet began to collapse. The weapon power cut off, and Lisa fell, and she could not breathe, and her heart stopped, and medical teams rushed. In and Amy was there covered in blood and screaming at Lisa to stay alive. Lisa died twice on the medical table, and Keleth, the life force burned down to almost nothing, and Ember fell from the sky and crashed into the hangar bay and reverted to a smaller form like a hatchling. They woke 3 weeks later in the medical bay, and the war was over in the Void Collective Vanguard fleet was destroyed, and the dimensional barrier was holding because the broadcast had disrupted the enemy attempts to break through. The cost had been terrible, and Admiral Morrison was dead, and thousands of others, and Haven Station was crippled and would take years to rebuild. But they had won. Lisa recovered slowly, and the bond remained, but it felt different now, and it was no longer forced or desperate, and it was a choice they made every day, and Keleth admitted she would make the bet again and accept the binding because Lisa had shown her that connection was not weakness. Ember learned to speak directly to Lisa, mind and words rather than feelings, and he called her Flame Sister and said she had Dragonheart in human form. Amy visited every day, and she had been promoted to commander, and she still worried about Lisa, but she admitted that what they had done was impossible and maybe necessary, and she just wanted her friend to be happy. Morrison's successor gave Lisa command of a new ship called the Stormweaver, and it was designed specifically for Dragon bonded crews and had a hangar large enough for Ember and quarters designed for Ethel and human cooperation.
Ow.
Their mission was to find the remaining ancient weapons and secure them before anyone else could, and to strengthen the dimensional barrier and ensure the Void Collective could never return. Keleth stood beside Lisa on the bridge of their new ship and wore formal Ethel armor that made her look like the warrior queen she was, and Ember coiled in his berth and watched them with ancient wise eyes through the viewport. They could see the construction yards where humans and Ethel worked together, building new ships and sharing technology and creating something neither race could have achieved alone. Lisa thought about the stupid bet that had started everything, and how she had thought she was so clever and had no idea where it would lead, and now she was bound forever to a mysterious warrior princess and an ancient dragon. Keleth felt her thoughts through the bond and smiled and asked if she regretted it, and Lisa grinned and said never, and that it was the best stupid decision she ever made, Ember. Laughter echoed through their shared consciousness, and the Stormweaver engines fired and they broke orbit heading into unknown space. The war was not over, and the Void Collective still existed beyond the barrier, and other threats lurked in the darkness between stars. But they would face it together, and they had something the enemy would never understand. They had each other, and they had chosen this bond not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Lisa had made a bet to date a vampire, and the vampire had marked her and bound their souls together forever, and Lisa had no regrets because sometimes the best things in life came from the choices that seemed the most foolish, and she had gained a partner and a dragon and a purpose that went beyond anything she had. Imagine the stars stretched endlessly before them, and adventures waited, and Lisa felt Keleth's hand slip into hers, an Ember presence warm in her mind, and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it as one.